Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. We just had one of our typical Archon attacks in that I was just about to go live on YouTube and everything just crashed, which was really extraordinary. To the second, absolutely to the second. But maybe it is something to do with the magical powers of our present, our guest today, which is we're going to be joined by the great Julian Vayne. And I mean great in very precise terms, because many years ago, I went to Breaking Convention, the very first Breaking Convention I went to. And we'll talk a little bit about Breaking Convention when we get into the interview. But it's a fantastic event that takes place over 2 or 3 days at the University of Greenwich. And there are lectures going on all the time. There's usually 2 or 3 lectures at any one time. And all of them were fascinating. But I went to see Julian speak. And I have to say, it was probably one of the most extraordinarily enlightening and fun lectures I've ever seen. He really is a force of nature. And the audience were just absolutely lapped up everything he said. And I've always wanted to get to know him better, because he's one of these people that just seems to have this kind of magical aura about him of enthusiasm and everything else as well. Now, I was going to read out an extensive thing about Julian and his background and all the wonderful things he's been involved in. But I think really, I'll just introduce him by saying Julian Vayne is a British independent scholar and author with over 3 decades of experience within esoteric culture, from Druidry to chaos magic, from indigenous shamanism through to Freemasonry and witchcraft. And what I'd like Julian to do is to introduce himself and just tell us a little bit about his background, how he has become such an eclectic, interesting thinker. So, Julian, welcome to the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour.
Anthony, it's lovely to be here. Sarah, it's good to see you. Wow, a very fine introduction. Thank you so much. I suppose when I'm asked, what are you? Can you define yourself? I mean, it's useful to have a kind of a convenient term to respond. So I describe myself as an occultist. So I'm someone who's interested in, that which is hidden. So that encompasses a whole range of different subjects, from kind of parapsychological stuff through to ritual magic, the limits of human consciousness and the way that things are in the universe in relation to this awareness that we find ourselves rising into. And I guess the reason for my eclecticism is because I don't have a tradition. I'm a white working class dude who's 53 from Stevenage in Hertfordshire. So my genesis and the nourishment for my interest, which I had since I was a kid, and I don't really understand quite why, was the opportunity to hang out in the relevant duodecimal section of the library in Stevenage and read everything that I could possibly get my hands on, and then start buying books, going to an esoteric shop that used to be in Northampton called Occultist when I was a kid, and spending my Christmas and birthday money on weird esoteric texts. And then I kind of got involved in Wicca initially, and the rest, as they say, is history. So my eclecticism is born of the fact that I imagine sometimes people say, well, this sort of shamanic register, what medicine have you got? And I say, my medicine is the medicine of the magpie. Like, I've had to kind of look around for the things that will inspire me, and I've had to kind of piece together an understanding of my spiritual kind of practice, and it draws on lots of traditions. And I'm very, very fortunate, as I guess everyone who's watching this is, that these days we have access to this incredible online library. It's many other things, but it is certainly a library. And so it's that kind of richness of those different traditions that I find fascinating. And so I hope that answers the question.
It certainly does. I mean, it's one of the things that I find. I mean, I've been interested in the occult ever since I was probably in my early teens. And it's something that's always fascinated me. And with me, it was an introduction to that part work, Man, Myth and Magic, that came out in the late 1960s. And I avidly read all of that. And of course, I was interested in the writings of people like Dennis Wheatley and everything else, as a lot of people in my generation were. But the occult fascinated me because, and I think the very first thing, there's the Witchcraft Museum down in Devon or Cornwall, isn't there, I think?
Boscastle.
Yeah. And I remember going to that and finding that intriguing and fascinating. And then many years later, I had the opportunity to visit the Museum of Witchcraft in Salem in Massachusetts, run by Laurie Cabot, the Cabot family in America. And it's always intrigued me, and I've always touched upon it. And I've met people who've been involved in the occult tradition over many, many years, but never really had the opportunity, because people don't necessarily talk about it a great deal, do they? It's something that's their own personal interest. So with you, what was the first area that you really got into? What was the first thing that sparked your interest of all of the various areas?
I mean, it was genuinely all of the above. So as a young man, a teenager, everything from kind of like dowsing, kind of stories of UFO contact. So the stuff that we perhaps more think of in terms of the kind of parapsychological side of things, but also this idea of, I encountered the work of Aleister Crowley and people like Sybil Leek, who was one of the sort of first witches, I suppose, to go from Britain to America to make a sort of a popular big career out of being a witch. So I encountered her work, the work of people like Doreen Valiente. And I guess I always had like a fascination for that kind of the ideas of kind of folk magic, the ideas of like a popular magic, and the way that those things have existed through culture, the things that academics these days call service magicians or the cunning folk. So the tradition of trying to use perhaps psalms or kind of bits of sympathetic magic to have particular effects in the world, but also the kind of more transcendent kind of traditions. So very interested in the kind of Eastern mystical traditions and what they had to say about awareness. So it was all of the above. The thing that actually I was able to access most readily was Wicca. So that's why I found myself as a teenager in, with my parents' permission, working in magical circles with a coven of witches in North London. And that was my kind of introduction to, I suppose, group practice. If you think of group practice.
Can you explain now, because this is the golden opportunity, for a lot of people out there who are unaware of these things. A term Wicca is used very, very regularly, and it's a term we use. What exactly is Wicca, and what the background to that?
Oh, I mean, briefly, because, Wikipedia is a thing. Wicca is a neo-pagan tradition which was formulated broadly in the mid-part of the 20th century and draws on elements of Freemasonry, ceremonial magic and folk tradition to create a kind of both a theology, so a duo-theology of a god and goddess, typically, and a sequence of ritual practices, both for operative magic, casting spells, and also for religious worship. There you go. That's probably the shortest that I can do for that.
Succinct and to the point. Okay, so the event joined this group in North London. Now, one of the things that has always fascinated me about people who are involved in the magical traditions is the billion-dollar question. Clearly, it's effective. It works. Yes?
I mean, yes. You have to... There are as many definitions of magic as there are magicians, and probably many more beyond that. So for me, my throwaway, but nevertheless, I think probably fairly helpful definition is that magic is the technology of the imagination. So it has various domains. So Alan Moore, for example, who self-identifies a magician, there he is writing astonishing stories and working with artists to produce these astonishing graphic novels. He would argue that art is a species of magic because you arrange things, words, in order to convey ideas and concepts and thus to change the world. I mean, otherwise the Communist Manifesto wouldn't be a thing, and neither would Mein Kampf, and artistic works that are, in terms of our mythologies and in terms of the stories we tell ourselves about the way the world operates, that is a species of magic. One might also suggest that what we call today psychology is a species of magic, in the sense that if you take, for example, self-affirmations, the idea of using a kind of an effect where we know that if we tell ourselves a narrative, we are more likely to inhabit that narrative. I remember David Luke, he did some fantastic research years ago now, I think for his PhD, on luck. And unsurprisingly, people who think they're lucky tend to be luckier in a variety of senses. So we can see some of this is parapsychological. Some of this is about kind of exploring awareness in and of itself. So encountering what might be understood as, I don't know, entities of some description. And does magic work? Yes. Does it have effects in the world? Yes. But it looks more like magic realism than it does like Harry Potter, if that makes sense. It's more like these kind of sea change kind of adjustments that are made in the individual or in culture, the culture around them, than it is like, you know, I point a wand and sparks fly out at the end of it. So does it work? The short answer is yes, but one has to kind of peer below the surface to understand what that means. And if you think of a technology of the imagination, if you think about something like placebo. So we use the word placebo, we just sort of throw it away. This is an incredibly powerful effect, powerful enough that we have to correct against it in drug trials. What is the effect? The effect is the ability of the imagination to affect physiological processes and also activities and behaviors in the world. That's quite a big deal.
Yeah, because this is quite fascinating, isn't it? Because when you were talking about that and the imagination, I was thinking of the mundus imaginalis of people like, and particularly the work of Mark Stavish, and the idea of egregores and creating egregores and the way in which we seem to have seemingly an effect on our environment at a distance, but we seem to be able to mold it depending upon our anticipations and our mood. Because I found that, you know, in my life, that when things, I'm very much a half, as Sarah knows, I'm very much a half empty glass rather than a half full. And I sometimes feel that I manifest my bad luck, and I seem to expect it to happen. And lo and behold, it does. And as you said, there are individuals around who manifest good luck continually. And there was a fascinating story. I did an event at the Scientific and Medical Network in Geneva many years ago. And the guy that had met me at the airport and was driving me around was a scientist and a researcher. And he was telling me about how something strange had happened to him. He had a very good run of good luck. And one day he suddenly realized that not for over a year, he hadn't seen a red light at a traffic light. Every single set of traffic lights he went through was green. And the minute he realized this, the very next set of traffic lights were red. And I found that quite extraordinary. It's as if almost we manifest in many ways our world. And of course, we can discuss this, you know, in quantum mechanics, you know, the collapse of the wave function. So we are discovering that there seems to be a one-to-one relationship between the observer and the observed in many ways. And of course, magic has said this for many years, hasn't it?
I mean, magic is predicated on a number of ideas that, and if we think of magic as a discourse, a story or series of stories going on in culture, sometimes this story is framed within religious terms, sometimes it's framed within quasi-scientific terms, sometimes it's acceptable within a culture, sometimes it isn't. But its underlying ideas are quite similar, no matter what the tradition, I would suggest. And they are things like the kind of self-similarity on different scales, the stuff that we now understand through things like complex nonlinear dynamics and chaos mathematics, fractals. And another way of putting that is as above, so below. Another way of saying that is that what happens inside is mirrored on what happens outside. I mean, these are all kind of, a lot of this stuff is like topological description rather than perhaps anything deeper than that, in the sense that we know that there is some sense in which awareness has this, and indeed all parts of the universe, they are connected. This is one whole universe. That's what the word points at. And that it's possible to create perturbations, changes in one part of the universe, and these will ripple, unsurprisingly, through everything else. Now, because everything is deeply interconnected with everything else, this includes conscious awareness, and it also includes what one might describe as the unconscious, or I like to use the phrase deep mind because it sounds more poetic and cool. So if you just think of it in that kind of sense, yes, that's the rationale for this, is that by manipulating the imagination, either of an individual or a group, and setting up various kind of conditions of perception and perhaps belief, that there are kind of ripples, let's call it outward into the universe, and ripples that appear that travel kind of inward into those individuals. And that is a way of engaging with the universe and of exploring it and perhaps changing it in some way.
I see. I see. So this one of the areas that I've long been fascinated. And again, it's something I know very little about, and I have the opportunity to ask an expert in this because, you know, in terms of chaos magic, when we use that term, what do we mean by that?
Again, Wikipedia is our friend. Chaos magic developed in Europe in the latter part of the 20th century. It was a style of magic which sought to remove itself from a kind of theological envelope. So if you were interested in Aleister Crowley, you were probably a Thelemite, that is to say a follower of the religion of which he is deemed to be a prophet, or possibly the prophet. So the other option in that period, in the latter part of the 20th century, was you could be a Wiccan. So you had a theological structure of a god or a goddess or seasonal rituals and so forth. What chaos magic sought to do was to escape from the sort of theocratic envelope and say, well, maybe magic can just be explored as magic, pure and simple, without necessarily having a particular ethic or a particular set of beliefs. And in fact, perhaps actually exploring these different beliefs about magic. So these different paradigms, you know, the idea that there's magic, for example, within the Germanic and Norse cultures, and it's often about the runes, or there is magic to be found in, 11th century kind of tantrism, and it's to do with the utilization of sacred sexuality or of internal kind of alchemy. So there are these different systems that one might move through to explore how they might be beneficial to an individual or an affinity group. So it was, in that sense, it was a kind of postmodern magic. It was a magic that said there are many beliefs, and these many belief structures can be entered into and explored. And it was also, I suppose, in some respects, it might be said to be kind of psychedelic, in the sense that it was very interested in the management and deployment of altered states of awareness. So if you think of something like an Anglican church ceremony, what's the belief system? Okay, so we have a particular understanding of the relationship of church and state. We have an understanding of the Bible, blah, blah, blah. There's the belief, Anglicanism. What's the way of changing awareness that's utilized within Anglicanism? Well, it's standing up and sitting down, standing up and sitting down, and standing up and sitting down, if you've ever been to one of those ceremonies. And it's also singing, and it's also, devotional prayer. So those are the kind of levers, if you like, of what's this altered state of awareness, which in chaos magic is described as gnosis. So that's the way the word is sort of slightly repurposed. But gnosis, this state of ecstatic dissolution, in a way, of the self and perhaps the ritual container that one is in. One becomes completely absorbed within this by the process of devotional prayer and of singing and so on. So chaos magic emerges as a postmodern tradition in the latter part of the 20th century, which is interested in altered states of awareness and the exploration of different types of belief, but without an overall theology around it.
And who were the people that first started that? Who were the founding fathers of it?
I mean, again, probably the most well-known is Pete Carroll. So he published a book in 1978 called Liber Null as a small circulation edition. And the publication was really designed to kind of set the scene for a sort of imagined magical order. And as is common with good magicians, the magical order then came into existence subsequent to the publication of the book. People thought, well, this is a jolly good idea, and they signed up, essentially. So Pete Carroll, I would also, in terms of people who are still very much involved in that style and that practice from those early days, point people towards the work of Dave Lee. So Dave is also somebody who's was involved in the kind of the early and then emerging story of chaos magic, particularly in relation to this magical order that Pete Carroll and I think Ray Sherwin and others kind of set up, which is the Magical Pact to the Illuminates of Thanateros. So my partner, Nikki Weird, she's been involved in chaos magic for about 30 years, so she probably knows a thing or two about it. I think she would, there are a number of people, I think, who were writing at the time. Again, all of this stuff people can kind of search out for themselves. But you're really looking at a development which is also framed by the culture. So you have, in Britain, the emergence of Margaret Thatcher's government. You have the sort of things like the protest movement, Stonehenge. You have this punk DIY side of things. So there's a sense of, well, you know, one doesn't have to be just a consumer of a form of occultism, which is roundabout theology. One can be a producer and experimenter with magic right here and now. So there was a great emphasis on try stuff out. Doesn't matter what they say in the books. Doesn't matter what some dude with feathers in their hair says. Go and have a go at this and experiment with yourself. And in addition, there was a little slice of kind of crazy wisdom through things like the Discordian tradition, which is obviously very big in the United States, this kind of playfulness around this whole thing. Playfulness and humor were seen as, and continue to be seen as, really important. You know, when you think that you've understood the universe and you've got some great psychic structure which explains everything, the best thing to do is to go up to it and go, because that's basically what it deserves. So, you know, this idea of kind of trying to see things from multiple perspectives, including the destabilization of the idea of magic itself. Hence the reason that a lot of chaos magic rituals, it's not uncommon to banish with laughter. So having done whatever the practice is, you laugh about how ridiculous it is, and then you go off and do something else.
That is, as I say, very much the punk ethos, isn't it? And I really quite like that approach to things. And one of the areas that I've become quite intrigued by, and I've known the term for a good many years, but never really dived into it, is hauntology. And the relationship between, particularly in the UK, or particularly even in England, the old traditions, together with our relationship with the landscape as well in this country. And funnily enough, a few weeks ago, I was staying with my father-in-law in his place in Chipping Norton. And I had the opportunity to go outside of Chipping Norton and go to the Rollright Stones, which is a place I'd always wanted to go to. And when I was there's a guy that is the custodian of them, and he is an expert, it seems, in dowsing. And I'd never really thought about dowsing in any particular way at all, although I'd known about it, obviously. And he said to me, look, I'll show you how it works. And he gave me, you know, the two of those bent metal sticks that you hold. And he said, right, okay, walk across towards the stones and see what happens. So I walked across, and there was a point where the things came into the middle and crossed each other. And he said, right, okay, let's test this out. And what they did was we just waited for another visitor to turn up. And he said, remember where they crossed? And then I said, okay. And we found another visitor. And we got that visitor to walk across roughly in the same direction, and exactly the same spot they crossed. And I was intrigued by this because I thought, you know, is it because there's some kind of lines of force within the ground that is making that happen? And I had a meeting a couple of days ago with Graham Nichols, who is an OBE trainer. And Graham was saying to me, no, it's to do with the way in which your mind works. And it's you being affected by the environment, and it's your muscles that are still making it move, but it's your muscles reacting to the fields around it. And I'd be interested to know your opinion on that as well, as to what is going on there.
Okay, so as an occultist, what I would be interested in is I would be interested in the spot. So I'd be interested in the fact that in this instance, two people have identified the same spot. What is it about the spot? Or what is it about the spot in relation to those two people? So rather than necessarily being initially concerned about the causality, like why is this thing happening, I would be interested in simply observing this thing in and of itself, and then saying what is the relationship here, and did you dig at the, I mean, not that you should, it's a scheduled ancient monument, but I mean, did you look very closely at the grass or anything like this? Were there perhaps, I don't know, exotic mushrooms growing in that particular place? Because for me, that would be like, okay, so for me at this time doing this practice, that seems to be a significant thing. Now, in answer to the causality question, there are, of course, a number of different ways that we can go here. It would be not uncommon for humans generally to talk about this in terms of either some kind of energy So whether we think of this as like lines of energy as imagined in places like, you know, China or Japan, or the modern kind of European reimagination of like ley lines and so on, that there's some sort of energetic pattern and it's responding to some sort of energy. We could, it's unlikely to come from us here and now, think about it in terms of spirits, you know, some kind of entity is involved in this. Or we can think of it in terms of, well, there are subtle motions in my body that perhaps respond to the environmental conditions. Water is the classic one, I suppose, with dowsing, and that these are amplified by the rods which then cross. Now, all of these ways of describing something have some value in them. And some of these seem to be more reasonable to us, you know, contemporary Western people in the 21st century, and some of them seem to be a little bit more off-piste. But actually, the explanationism that we choose is arguably not the most important thing. The most important thing is the situation and the event that happens. So, for example, if one were to do a magic ritual and encounter a spirit being in that magic ritual, one might spend an inordinate amount of time wondering about, you know, is it real? Is it a figment of my imagination? Is it an archetypal being? Is it from a Stargate universe adjacent to ours, which my ceremony has managed to allow this thing to come through? And frankly, there is actually no way to know, really. We can do all kinds of testing. Dowsing has been tested many times, and it's very, very difficult to replicate under scientific laboratory conditions, dowsing. But it is also the case that it's used by a number of people very successfully. I once briefly worked for a gold mining outfit in Australia, and they used dowsers, and they believed that they were more successful than the satellite imaging techniques. So we can think about this entity, for example, that we might encounter. As an occultist, I would say the most important thing is what happens when you meet that entity. So my point about the dowsing is the most important thing is what happened for you in relation to that spot. What did it do, even just that experience for you? Did it, for example, allow your universe to become subtly more untethered and more flexible, which might mean that perhaps, I don't know, you might use that slight untetheredness to change something, perhaps something related to the dowsing, perhaps not. You might, for example, imagine the glass is half full. So, you know, there's a lot of ways we can talk about the causality, but as an occultist, I'm more interested in what's the experience and what's the interaction that takes place in those things.
Excellent. Sarah, would you like to come in at this point with any comments and questions?
I was just thinking about your glass half empty thing and thinking you sounded a lot like Adrian Mole when you was talking about that.
Actually, funnily enough, a little known fact is my first name actually is Adrian, but I never ever go by it because I hate it so much.
Oh, that's brilliant. Oh my God, you've like you know, I often think with my work in dreaming actually that so much of our view of the universe is based upon really hilarious, stupid things that we encountered as children, like films and adverts and all this sort of stuff. It kind of goes in there. I've been taking part in Rianne and Roz's semantic sessions. They're doing this weekly talk and exploration of how language shapes our perception of the world. And it's something that I've been interested in for a really long time. And I think it's massively underestimated in terms of, you know, I'm the same as you, Julian. I come from like a very working class family in Croydon. I think I got into the idea of magic because it made my world a little bit more exciting. I was always super into dreams as a kid. And so I would go to the library, read everything and anything I could find about that, because it gave you some sense of having some personal agency, I suppose, some sort of magic and power to change your reality. And I would often escape into my imagination as well. But, you know, I'm fascinated with all of the things that you've been talking about, and it's stuff that I'm really interested in as well. And I was thinking about, you know, one of the things I'm very interested in is the history of language affecting our reality, and languages being considered as a form of magic in the first instance. So things like I started to study hieroglyphs during lockdown, and I started to see, you know, the Egyptian word for hieroglyphs is Medu Neja, and they're considered to be magical thought forms in a way. And by creating and writing, you're manifesting things into reality, which I find a fascinating concept. And I think you're absolutely right as well about, I see magic as ultimately creativity. like the ancient Egyptian word for magic, Heka, is about force of will, I guess, and creativity, creation, the kind of conscious control of the creative spirit, the ka. And so I think that, you know, this is the thing we often talk about on this show, is how in some ways I think artists and creative people have this responsibility of creating good futures for humanity, because I do think artists and creative people have an enormous amount of power. As I often talk about the fact that I'm into Star Trek, and Star Trek, if you look at something like Star Trek, like a really long-running TV show, it's inspired generations of children to pursue careers in space and science. And a lot of the technologies that they use in Star Trek have actually, because it's a kind of, like you say, about the book that's written, and then people start joining the cult. If something's a good idea and it's creative, people go for it, and then they actually start creating those things. So I think magic is, in the material realm, a sort of slow, dripping stalagmite type of effect. And in the dreaming realm, these things happen really fast. And I think that that's one of the things that I love about lucid dreaming, is you have that sort of instantaneous magic where you can change things immediately. But I see the same effects happening in real life. They just take much longer and are much more subtle to come to fruition.
I guess, yeah, I agree with those many of those points. I think that that's why I said it's more like magic realism than it is like kind of Harry Potter. And I also acknowledge that, yeah, lucid dreaming is fantastic because you have a much more kind of plastic environment in which to work. And the plasticity of awareness that's part of the reason, although I don't think it wasn't certainly articulated in quite this way, that chaos magicians are very interested in these gnostic states or altered states of kind of awareness. Because when we enter those states, we can, within the imagination, do all sorts of interesting things. And those states themselves can have really profound effects in the apparent world. So one of my interests is psychedelics. And one of the things that psychedelics do is they break down the existing preconceptions and even sense of personal awareness that we normally have, and give us an opportunity to reconfigure that. And that can have, you know, meaningful consequences for people in terms of healing, in terms of problem solving, and in terms of kind of recalibrating their existence in relation to, you know, the big archetypal questions of, you know, God and meaning and the world and all of those sorts of things. So I think that we know that, you know, if we take the experience of dream, you know, for many of us every night we have this opportunity to go into this reality where there is both material sort of drifting down from the day, is how I imagine it. You know, there's all the stuff that you did in the day in those dreams that are the sort of, you know, the drifting down of the material into the unconscious. And there's also within that this opportunity to connect with this deep mind. And that opportunity exists within sleep and dream, and it exists within many, many other states of awareness. And by exploring those, which, you know, you and I obviously were really interested in these things as kids, partly because that's kids are interested in exploring awareness. That's how they learn. And secondly, because, you know, if you are in an environment where you have a sense that there must be something bigger than this, there must be something deeper than this, there must be something wider than this, then it's that desire in a way to make meaning, but to understand that that meaning will never be ultimately known or fixed, which is why I describe myself as an occultist. Yes, I want, like Anthony's saying, I kind of want to know, why do the dowsing rods? Of course I do. I mean, it would be disingenuous to say I'm not interested. But I also realize that any meaning that I pin on something can always be subverted and changed and amended. And it's the experience itself, the experience of the dreaming, the experience of this altered state of awareness, the experience of dowsing. That's why Chaos Magic says, do these things. You know, find a book, however inaccurate it might be, within reason, and try some stuff out, explore your awareness. This is what we do as children. As soon as we can stand, we spin round and 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 sit down, because we can, because we're designed to explore awareness. That's one of the things that awareness is kind of, in order to utilize it successfully, Our conscious awareness is arguably to some extent a tool for making sure that our bodies work, and our body is both an interpersonal body as well as our physical structure. But in order to explore that, in order to develop that, in order to deepen that, that's why, in my opinion, magic is the art of becoming purely human, deeply human. You know, the art of creating a soul. That's what it's actually really about, rather than just getting a bigger job or a fancier car. Those things may be helpful, but that's not really the project.
Yeah, I was thinking about that recently, actually, when I was at church. I was like trying to reconcile how I can be in church and have this experience, this Holy Spirit experience, and have this transcendental experience. And then theologically, I want to ask loads of questions, and I want to doubt, and I want to sort of interrogate it at the same time. But I had this kind of little epiphany of the fact that it is about perfecting the soul and nourishing the soul, and acknowledging that this is something that can be fed. You know, it's a tangible thing. And I think, you know, on the subject before, when you were saying about as children growing up in places where you think there must be more to this, and one thing that I think gets hugely underestimated is the amount of time children spend playing. I think playing is an altered state of consciousness. When you're deeply engaged in playing as a child, your reality is overlapped with this sort of imaginary field of thought where you are creating. And when I was a kid and I used to play, I really saw, but in this sort of transparent film way, other things happening in my reality. And I think it's something that we can access, maybe points at this, perhaps the sort of bicameral mind, where you get the imagination, the dreaming and reality perception overlapping, which is, you know, I read an article a few years ago about how babies experience the world like they're on acid. And I think perhaps children have this ability to dream and see the world simultaneously. And as we get older, and perhaps especially when we go through puberty and the neural pathways are pruned back, we get more focused and attention, and we're more kind of more kind of the brainwaves associated with just seeing reality and getting on with tasks and doing things and seeing things in this more kind of straightforward, rational way.
I mean, this idea of as we go through our experience growing up in this culture and this time, the idea that we become very good at narrowing our focus, because I have to write this essay, that's what I have to do, you know, everything else can go hang, I'm just doing this particular task. There's a value and a power in that, but having that, accessing that kind of childlike ability to have not a kind of a spotlight consciousness, but a lantern consciousness that's kind of all around, that's all encompassing. There are techniques that allow us to kind of go back into that state, or to access that state. And those things are helpful from a well-being perspective. Those things are beneficial from the point of view of, you know, our ability to be in various states, including that narrow state. They actually support that. So to be able to kind of enter those playful states. If you think of ceremony, if you think of ritual, what ritual is to some extent is it's playing. I'm going to play that it's Halloween, and that's the special time when we think about our ancestors, and we think about death, and I'm going to do ceremonial actions. This is a playful kind of activity, in the sense that it's much more like the kind of thing that we tend to do as children, and we tend to bud this off into kind of religiosity, and it becomes attenuated in many people's lives. But it's absolutely essential for our psychic health, and really, I think, for our health, not just as individuals but as communities. You know, we have community rituals and things all the time, but to enter spaces also where we're exploring, you know, whether that's through kind of psychedelics, whether that's psychogeographical practices, whether that's artistic practices, those things are incredibly, incredibly valuable. I'll give you a simple example and then I'll shut up. Many years ago, I used to teach older people how to use computers. And what they would say to me is they would say, oh, it's terribly complicated. Could you give me a list of what to do? And I would say, no, that's simply not possible. I can't give you a list of what to do, any more than I could give you a list of how to do driving. I mean, except in very broad terms, you know, turn this on, blah, blah. I had to teach them to play. I had to teach them to experiment. I had to create a system where they were secure enough to do that. I would say, look, if it all goes horribly wrong, we'll turn it off, we'll turn it back on again. Chances are it'll be fine. And they would then get them into like, oh, what does this do? What does this do? What does this do? So we forget this skill, or it is not highly valued in many workplace environments and many kind of other cultural settings within the situation we find ourselves in. But it is absolutely essential. We must play, and it's fun. That's the kind of point.
I wonder whether it's something that comes about where a sense of time gets sort of ingrained in our consciousness, and we start to think we have to go to school at this time, we have to have food at this time, we have to do that at this time, and it actually becomes embodied, this sense of time. And you know, I mean, when my daughter was small, you know, taking her for a walk in the park, she would just stand and look at a spider web for an hour if I didn't feel like I had to go somewhere, because you know, that's quite a long time to look at a spider web, but you know, I can appreciate that is great for a kid. So things like that, I do think it's to do with this embodied sense of time, which kind of creates a lot of our modern neurosis. And I often think about the kind of evolution of consciousness, and perhaps human beings going from nomadic hunters, where they were constantly moving through space, and so any sense of self was related to the body and the experience of existing in that moment. And that when we started to build houses and started to live in the same place all the time, the house becomes this kind of axis mundi, and this macrocosm of the human, and also this microcosm of the entire world within this one place. So I find that, you know, the way that language influences our perception of reality, our culture and our habits form our perception of reality as well. And I totally agree that human beings should spend more time in play. And I think that you're right, rituals are about dressing up, about having props, and about playing a role. And I think another thing that I am super keen on, and that doesn't get celebrated much in wellness circles or any of these kind of modern transformative technologies, is how important it is to have a sense of humor and have fun and really laugh and be ridiculous. Like, people want to be taken so seriously these days, but actually being really stupid and silly is a huge dimension of play, and it's a alchemical experience. When you're in hysterics about something, it can be like hugely therapeutic. But I think that, you know, in the modern manifestation of I don't know, like ritual activities, wellness sort of activities that you might see at festivals, it's a hard thing to do, because it genuinely comes from long-standing relationships quite often, or unique interpersonal chemistry. It's not something you can pay 30 quid for and suddenly experience cracking up, because you need to have that natural spark and chemistry with people.
I think it's quite interesting here. Can I just jump in here very quickly? The flow is really, really interesting and really good. But there's one or two points I'd be interested in making here. The first one is, I really thought it was wonderful that we had Sarah Janes talking about Julian Janes. So there was a kind of a nice pun there and a nice kind of circularity there as well. But I was reminded, when you were talking about play, and you were talking about the way in which play seems to open up channels that we don't normally work on, as if it makes us become younger and, you know, sort of thinking in the world in a much more magical way. I'm reminded of the Philip experiments that took place in Toronto in 1970, when a group of people were manifesting. They were trying to create a spirit, which they called Philip Aylesford. And it was a completely mythical person. They'd made the person up. But they found that Philip would manifest far more effectively when they sang and they laughed and they joked, because they tried to do it seriously initially and they couldn't manifest anything. But as soon as the sense of fun comes into it, and as you say, the sense of ritual, suddenly things seem to come out of the ether when that happens. Julian, again, for you to carry on with that theme. I mean,
there's such rich territory. The Philip experiment, a very, very, very interesting example of a practice that, you know, I'm really familiar with in you know, occult circles, because we create, whether they're called servitors or thought forms or ally spirits or whatever, and interact with these entities. And again, rather like in the Philip experiment, there's this notion from Vihinga and Austin Spare of as if. So we act as if this is a real thing, and we do our seance, even though, you know, we've created a backstory for Philip which is logically inconsistent. We act as if it is believable, And that, again, links back very much, as you say, to the playful thing. Interesting point that you raised, Sarah Janes, about this idea of time. We know that in many altered states of awareness, dream is one of them, there is time dilation. Time goes weird. You know, it doesn't follow. Basically, the type of consciousness where we have spotlight consciousness, which in neurological terms, we could think of this as being, similar to this notion of the default mode network, this kind of like focused attention, particularly when that focused attention is inwards and we're talking about our own narrative. This is my sense of self. This is what I did yesterday. This is what I'm going to do tomorrow. You know, that type of consciousness has a value, but in many situations, and perhaps within other kind of cultural settings, having a lantern awareness. So if I see a bird move, I just go, oh, a bird has moved. So what? Means nothing to me. Whereas if I'm deeply embedded in my landscape and in the seasonal flow and the availability of food and so forth, a bird moving means that a predator is moving further away, which means that something else is happening back along. So I have this wider awareness. Now, when we do, for example, neurological research with psychedelics, we look at the psychedelic state, this expanded form of awareness, and we go, well, this is a weird thing that drugs do to a brain. But actually, this is also the situation that children find themselves in as they slowly acquire language. There's an attenuation from that. This is the state that we find with other types of mystical experience and with other kinds of situations where there is a change within what we consider our default state. It's interesting as a culture that we call the default mode network state such from experiments that involve taking an isolated human being and putting them in an fMRI scanner. So there's a kind of cultural assumption that what a human is a thing you can look at when it's on its own in an incredibly noisy brain scanner. And that's really fascinating because I think that what a human is an interpersonal kind of creature. And it's that state of awareness, whether turned up through psychedelics or whether or not existing in interpersonal flow or with a group of musicians who are jamming together, that is our actual default state. That is the most common state, probably throughout time and culture. We are in a weird position that we believe that our default state is this self kind of narrativizing process, which is this very, very kind of narrow spotlight in the world that we inhabit. And we can change this. It's actually relatively easy. The brain is a remarkable, flexible thing, both on an individual and cultural level. And in order to do it, we need altered states of awareness. We need playful experience. We need to find enhanced ways of connecting with the world around us. And there are many ways to do that.
I found that quite fascinating in many, many ways, because one of the areas that I've long been interested in ever since my studies at university is the relationship that we pointed on before, but the relationship between language and perception, and language and how we perceive the world. And we did work on the research of people like Vygotsky and the way in which children have this kind of inner narrative of speaking, you know, and sort of also then you have the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and the idea that in many ways our anticipations and our language mold the way we see the world. And of course, you know, the classic example, and again, bringing in the whole concept of time and linearity of time. And of course, we see time, the future is on the right side and the past is in the left, because that's how we write. Whereas other cultures write differently, and how the verbs are formed, you know, in Sanskrit, the verb form is very different to the verb form within Indo-European language. Well, of course, that's Indo-European language is Sanskrit, idiot. But generally, you know, the idea of how language, and of course, in ritual traditions and magical traditions, we have the two things, don't we? We have the dressing up and the ritual of the clothing and everything else, as you do, Julian, in your magical object podcast, you know, the idea of what this object is imbued in. But also then we have the language aspects and how the language is used. And Sarah, again, you know, your fascination with hieroglyphics, you know, it just seems that language is what we structure the world by and what we understand the world to be. So magic seems to be both. And I'm intrigued that all three of us are from very similar backgrounds. You know, I'm from a very working class background up on Merseyside. And magic, when I became involved in it, it enlightened my world. It made me interested in something else that was not just part of the everyday mundane reality of living on Merseyside in the late 60s. You know, it was opening a different world in many, many ways.
I mean, we know the deities associated specifically with magic in many pantheons are the deities associated with language, the deities associated with letters, the sacred letters, whether they are Sanskrit, whether they are runes, whether they are the Hebrew alphabet, whether they're the hieroglyphics of Tahuti. So, you know, that connection is very clear. And it's also clear that language has this kind of these delicious paradoxes. So we need language in order to structure our thoughts. And also we understand that our thoughts can escape our language, and we can have language which makes perfect logical sense, but is completely impossible even perhaps to imagine. I can say there is a white cube which is entirely black, and that makes linguistic sense. But of course, you try and visualize, well, what would that mean? So we have a sense in which both language both contains things and also kind of creates the launch pad for the escape from language. So we have to, you know, if we have to acquire language, otherwise, arguably, we don't become fully human, because to be human is to have this interpersonal kind of reality. And if we have language given to us by our caregivers, however good, bad, or indifferent, we find ourselves in this interpersonal world, and we structure our form of reality in relation to that. Because a human being on its own is completely useless. A human being can only survive and thrive in community with others. You know, we know this very, very deeply. And that language is also the thing that we can then kind of utilize to go beyond it. And we can use it. A lovely example that I like to use is that there's an avant-garde filmmaker called Maya Deren. And Maya Deren also wrote a book, Divine Horseman. She was one of the first Westerners, white people to be initiated into a voodoo society in Haiti. And she describes the experience of the gods coming down and possessing her as the descent of the white darkness. Now, that doesn't really make any sense. What does it mean to white darkness descending? But poetically, it clearly, for anyone who's even got a vague sense of these things, points towards this thing, which is kind of outside the net of language, but which language can still kind of gesture towards with its words. So yes, it is this deeply magical thing, this deeply paradoxical thing. It has all these delicious things within it. You know, there are two sorts of people in the world, those who think there are two sorts of people and those who don't. I mean, stuff like that, you know, amazing, like how it does that. Slippery, weird serpent of a thing.
Well, because we are so structured by our language, and we are restricted by our language in so many ways. You know, that people, when I interview them and they've had weird experiences, when they've had encounters with aliens, when they've had encounters with entities, or when they go into altered states of consciousness, our very language stops us being able to explain the ineffable, you know, and you find that we come up against this all the time, don't we?
And yet we have the word ineffable, which points towards a thing which cannot be spoken about in conventional language. So language is still able to kind of gesture towards this thing. And to some extent, that's also kind of sort of its purpose. So as we explore the world, we create kind of linguistic networks around things. So if I say magic is the technology of the imagination, I mean, it's kind of true, but it's also complete nonsense. So it's in a way to kind of get us sort of slightly there. It's an ever-receding mystery. In some respects, what the borders and boundaries of it are, but we definitely know that it structures our thoughts. We definitely know that, you know, and that's unsurprising, because the whole thing about consciousness is it's a guessing machine for what comes next. So all of the technologies we have, in terms of those kind of deep structural technologies, are technologies for sort of trying to make sense of the world, and this ability to take a glyph, a sign, and to be able to encode data through a sequence of them is incredibly clever. I mean, it's brilliant. And it's arguably from hardwired stuff. You know, there's the famous Buba and Kiki effect, where you have, you know, these, again, Wikipedia is our friend. So Buba and Kiki. Let me just, I'll draw it. You know the one I mean? So it's like a spiky sign and like a round sign. And it's cross-cultural, cross-linguistic. you know, again, when you were talking about these kind of underlying, you know, Proto-Indo-European, and we look at the sounds and the kind of the sense of like the onomatopoeia, the sense of like watery sounds having a certain kind of quality, or motherly sounds having a certain type of quality. So it's like language emerges from us as much as we are a container, or that we are structured by it. It's a strange and definitely magical thing.
Yeah, because that was Saussure, wasn't it? And sort of linguistic structures, and the lower structures of reality. And I'm thinking here, you know, because I'm delighted at this conversation, because it's what I hoped it would be, a kind of free-flow exchange of ideas. And we think to throw into here synesthesia, you know, and the way in which language has a physicality to it, you know, and people like Scriabin and individuals like that saw music and sound in shapes. And Sarah, is it you that's getting quite involved in synesthesia at the moment? I know there's somebody in my wider circle that is interested in this.
It's not me, but I have always been interested in synesthesia. And I think that, you know, I was saying about, I think it was a New Scientist that published that article about babies being on acid, but I think it's more like babies are synesthetic naturally. And as we get older, we become less synesthetic. But Rebecca Sharrock, who we've had as a previous guest with a highly superior autobiographical memory, she's synesthetic. And I think that is very fascinating to me, because part of her synesthetic perception and experience of the world is how she categorizes memories, because her memories, if you remember, are kind of color coded synesthetically. So I think that synesthetic experiences are also kind of compatible with the psychedelic experience as well, when you start to like not necessarily process the senses through your ordinary channels, and like you say, your brain in dreaming and in the psychedelic experiences is more broad and open to experiencing everything at the same time, rather than having that spotlight attention on something.
It's interesting thinking about stuff like synesthesia and that previous guest, because one of the things with language, obviously, is language is particularly writing, is a means to memory. It's a means to recalling things and being able to encode things that can then be transferred through multiple generations into multiple locations. And it would be interesting to hypothesize the fact that, you know, okay, human beings probably been making signs for a very, very long time, way before we were kind of the anatomical creatures that we are now. But one might also imagine that, like, lurking around in the architecture of the human mind is the possibility for other styles of language that involve more domains of representation. For example, with people with synesthesia who have a color domain associated intimately with sound or with memory. Or you take the example of people who use sign language, who have both the ability to show signs sequentially in the way that we have with spoken language, but also vary the shape and location of the sign as well, and to provide other nuances of understanding within that. So it may well be that, you know, cut to, who knows, 2 years' time, perhaps longer, that we emerge with other styles of language that are able perhaps to articulate new things. Mathematics, one might suggest, is a style of language space. So where we can describe things, we can talk about things, we can conjecture things, we can explore things. So actually language is this, it's a very kind of amorphous tool. So it is both a limiting factor in some respects, but also it has all these possibilities embedded within it. And I think that's, you know, that's why it's such a fascinating artifact of humans to employ.
Moving on then, one of the areas we've touched upon is breaking convention. And we're all three of us are regulars, and there's a number of people that have been our guests in the past who are involved in breaking convention, also a good deal of the people that watch this program. And I understand that you were one of the founding members of breaking convention. So could you? But you're
no,
I'm
not a founding member. I mean, I'm a hanger-on essentially.
Right.
So my partner Nikki Weird went to the first breaking convention, and I can't remember how long ago she's became a member of the directors and is the current chair of the breaking convention. So I've been involved in it since 2015, I think, something like this.
Oh,
maybe.
it's the first time I went. Yeah,
yeah,
right.
yeah,
okay.
yeah. Yeah, I did. 2015, maybe there was one. I can't remember. Anyway, it's in the past. So I'm involved with it as part of the wider committee of kind of organisers of things. There's about 20 of us, and then there's the kind of the directors who they're the people that carry the can, because it's a registered charity. So they're our formal trustees, and they have to do all the stuff with reporting accounts and doing all the things that need to be done to keep the charitable status going. But I've been involved with helping organise volunteer teams. Done exhibitions at at Breaking Convention, and of course been a speaker there as well. So it will be happening next year. I think I'm permitted to say that it will be happening at the University of Exeter, and it will be around about the 20th of April. And we're really looking forward to being in a space which is a beautiful, beautiful campus with a glorious botanic garden at its centre, and hopefully all of the environments where we can do all of the kind of cool stuff that's like, Sarah, the stuff that you were doing with Carl with the VR, and I still want to go of the Eleusinian mysteries through the miracle of an Oculus Rift. So there will be all of that stuff, and it will be April in next year that we'll be doing that. I mean, it's a great thing to be involved with, because for me, it's some of the richest conversations I've ever had have happened on the lawn outside Breaking Convention when we've been in Greenwich.
Julian, quite interesting. Sarah and I were discussing this a few weeks ago, and the last Breaking Convention we all met up at, I don't think we got to any lectures because we spent so much time talking.
It's so good. And you're sort of sat there, and we will do the same thing in Exeter. In fact, actually, maybe we might even come up with some ways to kind of deliberately stir the pot and get people really kind of, because this is an important part of what the thing is about. I've sat there in a little circle of friends, eating sandwiches and talking about what we've seen or what we're up to. And then suddenly I realized that, this is one of the leading people on imaging of, 5-MeO DMT in the brain in the world. And then this is like some kind of dude who runs an ayahuasca retreat center in Peru. And this is some bloke who's just come along because he's interested in mushrooms. And this is someone who's a writer of great renown, blah, blah, blah. And we're all just chatting. And we're all just doing what we're doing now, just exchanging ideas and exchanging thoughts around about this kind of mutual shared subject, which of course also is so multivalent. Everything from the kind of law enforcement side of things, the cultural side, the neurological, pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, the kind of emerging therapeutics sphere. It's all here. So yeah, people who are listening, please come along to the next one. It's going to be amazing. It's a very, very good venue.
I find, and I'm sure a lot of people that go to it find, I miss it so much, and it's something I look forward to so much, and I enjoy every single second I'm there. And it's, you just bump into people, and and everybody is, I suppose it's a collective of people who share the same interests, whereas the greater community don't. And it's the opportunity to really exchange great ideas like we're doing now, because this is almost like a mini Breaking Convention. And you meet people, and the ideas, as you say, you get talking to people and you realize there's somebody extraordinarily famous, and everybody's normal and everything. I mean, I had long chats last time with Eric Davis, and it was just wonderful. And Serena Roney Dougal, I spent hours with her talking about the most amazing things. And it's absolutely wonderful. And I think, Sarah, was that the first time we met? I can't remember. I think it probably wasn't, but I'm glad you mentioned the whole thing about the illusion. I think it was, wasn't it? Because what we're trying to do, Julian, at the moment is that 2 of my books have recently been published in Greek, and one of the things, we did the event in the Dracula tunnels a few years ago. And what we're trying to do, I've discovered from my research the location of where an academic writing in 1901 believed the original Plato's cave was. And it's the cave of Vari in Heim. And we think we can get access to that. And if we can, it means that we could take the seventh wave, we could take the Lucia device, and we could recreate what we did at Dracula in Plato's cave itself. And that would be extraordinary. Now, one of the things we were discussing, for instance, and I think the imagery would work fantastically well, there's a couple of guys called Dreaming Jaguars, who I think you will probably know, and they've interviewed David Luke and various other people. And one of the guys there, he's one of the world's experts on filming on drones. And the idea we had was to have a drone take off from the Acropolis and the Parthenon, fly out over the Saronic Gulf, fly round the inner islands like Egina and everything, then over Cape Sunion, then come out on the bay and fly into the cave. And then I'm standing there wearing my purple robes going, welcome to the Eleusinian Mysteries. And we think that would be just an amazing start to something that could be extraordinary. And it'd be wonderful to have you involved as well, because the more people we can have involved in this, the better, really. But the reason I brought up Breaking Convention was now the dovetailing between the esoteric and the occult with entheogens and how that works now. And I'd just love to talk to you about that and your thoughts and feelings on it and everything else as well.
Okay, so we know that obviously within what we might think of as in the broadest sense, the magical traditions of many cultures, psychedelic substances, and more broadly, psychoactive substances are used. They are few and far between the cultures that don't use them in some respect or other. There are various situations where there are prohibitions and so on. But we know at the root of many religious beliefs, we have things like Soma and Homa and all of that kind of stuff, right? So we've got that. More relevant to, I guess, the styles of magic that I'm particularly kind of connected with, the Western Esoteric Tradition. We know that there's a strong relationship with things like henbane and a number of other kind of deliriant type substances. And also a very strong relationship with cannabis. And so the go-to book there is Chris Bennett's Liber 420. So in more kind of contemporary situation, we know that some of the first people to experiment with mescaline when it came into Europe were members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And obviously we've got characters like Aleister Crowley making use of these substances in his public rites of Eleusis at the Caxton Hall in, 1909, 1910, around about there. So there is a I guess a sort of, in a way, attenuated but nevertheless extant kind of lineage between Western magic and methods of altering consciousness using substances. There may be other stuff embedded within the alchemical traditions, because there are a number of substances that one might make with kitchen top table chemistry, let alone chemistry where you've got decent retort vessels and an alligator hanging from your ceiling. So you can make, for example, dimethyltryptamine, DMT, relatively easy from a number of kind of sources. So there is definitely this kind of relationship, and the relationship is in part to do with the fact that, as per the earlier kind of comments, these altered states of awareness are the kind of spaces in which magic can be most easily woven. And that includes dream, it includes altered states through breath work, and it certainly includes altered states arrived at through exogenous chemistry, through taking drugs. If we then look across at the various forms of what has been called shamanism, whatever your pronunciation, and whether or not you like the fact that the ethnographers have broadened this term away from just Siberian culture and into the Americas, we can definitely see within a number of cultural kind of settings the use of psychedelic substances for what we could broadly call magical practices or ceremonial healing practices, things like this, where we're using this plastic state of awareness. We're using this altered state in order to create various kind of effects. So that, in a nutshell, is the relationship between these fields, I guess.
Because I'm thinking of that wonderful book by Paul Devereaux, is it called The Long Road or something, about the history of hallucinogenic substances within Europe, and it's very intriguing. And when we did the Dracolo event, it was fascinating to note, again, linguistically here, the word Dracolo, is Dragon's Hill in Anglo-Saxon. And somebody, one of the group, and I can't remember who it was, noticed that magic mushrooms are actually growing around the Dracula caves themselves. So there was a direct link there, wasn't there, sir? I think. Was there, who picked on that? I can't remember.
I can imagine, but I can't remember actually. I don't remember that bit.
We were all too cold, but
it was freezing, and it was an amazing place. Like the sort of geomancy of it was very potent. Me and Leonard didn't like it very much, actually. I felt that, you know, because it was this war bunker and then a nuclear bunker for the royal family. It had a particular kind of energy. Lots of interesting mold formations on the walls as well. It was an amazing, weird place. Have you ever been down there, Julian?
No, it sounds completely bonkers.
Yeah.
Oh,
really,
you need
really,
to.
really
It was
amazing.
It was a shadow factory, and what happened was the British government in the late 1930s realized that war was coming, so they actually employed Rover to build a totally secret factory, and it's a kind of a sandstone outcrop in Dracula, and it had ancient mine workings in it, but they actually developed the mine workings and they built, and there's about 5 miles of tunnels just drilled into the hillside, and they're probably about 30 foot wide by probably 20 foot high, and they just go into the darkness like a gridiron. And it is extraordinary. It has this extraordinary power. And there's a couple of guys been researching it for a few years and tell me that that it's terribly haunted. And there was one photograph that one of the guys down there showed me on his phone. And it was extraordinary. We were standing in this corridor. And, well, he was telling me this strange thing happened whereby it's like a gridiron, so everything goes out on angles. And he was explaining to me, said once he was down there and the noises started and the poltergeist activity started. So he had a can of Pepsi, an empty can of Pepsi. And he said to the whatever was in there, give me this back. And he threw it down one of the corridors in one direction. And the can teleported and landed at a right angle in one of the corridors the other side. And they heard it land. And then he showed me this photograph that was taken in a point we were standing. And the only thing I can describe, it was like a star being. It was the shape of a human being, but it was like made of stars, a little like you're probably too young to remember the old grey whistle test, but that kind of character, the character that kicks the ball. It was a bit like that, you know. And I thought extraordinary. And unfortunately, I've never been able to use that photograph because it's somebody owns it, but it's an incredible place and it has this incredible energy, but incredibly just weird is the only way I can describe it. But unforgettable. I think everybody, I mean, David Luke was there with his little team, and I know that everybody that was involved in that has never really forgotten it because it was so strange.
I mean, you mentioned earlier on hauntology, which we didn't really follow up, but I think one of the things for me, which is really important, is my relationship with place and with landscape. So some of the work that I do is, rather grandly called psychogeography, but site-specific ritual and walking practice through the landscape. And there are some interesting things in relation to this idea of play, in relation to this idea of lantern awareness. So part of the point of things like psychogeography, as I'm sure everyone knows, is to kind of shake up our normal way of being in the world. So a simple example is that, when we take if we're walking to work, for example, if we have that as an opportunity, we tend to go the same way. We tend to take the line of least resistance. Human beings, creatures of habit, very sensible, very wise, less energy. But if we take a different route, we see different stuff, we experience things differently, we become a little bit more open. Then we can kind of explore things like the rave, randomly wandering through cities. We can kind of do all sorts of explorations of ways of being in the place, responding to it kind of artistically or through song or whatever. And then you have that there are some places that have an inherent kind of liminal or weird in both the sort of the modern and maybe the archaic sense of the term. They are weird places. They are transitional locations. They are a shadow factory. How much more evocative would you like this, sir? I mean, it's a shadow factory, amazing. So you have this kind of liminal space and you have this liminal experience of like darkness. You know, we get most of our information from our eyes, and so therefore, like, darkness is associated with that uncertainty, that liminality, that kind of transition into the unknown, into the occulted, the hidden. And so when we find ourselves in these power places, it's interesting to kind of just tune into whatever's going on in whatever way is available to us and see what happens. You know, one might be kind of, you know, mindful and thoughtful about all the usual scary kind of stuff, but basically the attitude of kind of thoughtful curiosity about these things is the way that I would like to kind of, you know, approach that, in much the same way that you're crossing of the dowsing rods. What through the Coke can bag, sorry, Pepsi, other brands are available. What through the can bag, we don't know. We can imagine all sorts of things. We can imagine like any number of explanations. But the event itself took place. How did that feel? What were its effects? What does it mean? Not in a causal sense, but like, what does it tell us about our sense of being in the universe? If nothing else, what these things tend to tell us is that the models that we have of reality are subsets of reality, and therefore, while however good they may claim to be, there are always bits of reality that's kind of escape it, you know, rather like in that whole kind of like demonic reality kind of concept, you know. So the experience of seeing this star being, the experience of having that can thrown back at that person, like inhabiting that experience and exploring that in and of itself without necessarily having to collapse the waveform into and this is what it is, or this is what it means, you know. That's the approach that I like to have with those things. But yeah, fascinating and not uncommon. You know, I mean, there's this sort of notion that we live in this sort of rationalist world, and that's kind of true, although I think that the direction is towards kind of post-rationalism, where the subjective is valued as equally real, though different. But actually, huge numbers of people experience, you know, encounters with spirit entities or with dying relatives, or like there are various figures kind of quoted. These are everyday occurrences for people. And I think the most important thing often is to be with the experience in and of itself. So I've had, as I'm sure you've had, friends who sort of say, "Oh, I dreamt that I met my friend or my relative who died, you know, many years ago or recently or whatever, and I had this experience." And they'll tell this story, and you say, "Well, but you did. This is a real experience. You did have this. It's not necessarily the same order of reality or exactly the same form of reality as the reality of tables and chairs, but nevertheless, this is a real subjective experience. Privilege it in that sense." In the same way that if you go to many cultural settings, people will simply say, "Oh, I met my grandmother last night," or "I met my grandmother in a dream," but without the word dream being a modifier to say, "and it's not real."
Mm. Yeah, that's such an important point, isn't it? You know, the definition of exactly what we define as real anyway, because of everything, you know, and interestingly enough, you know, one of the things I'm fascinated by, and I was discussing this with Graham Nichols a few days ago in London, was that he went down to Avebury with a friend of his a few weeks ago, and he had a series of extraordinary experiences there, you know, where he met some old guy who was turning around and saying, "Oh, this old guy turned around and said, oh, he sensed that the aliens were going to be around that night." And Graham and his mate thought, "Oh, well, why not? We might as well go along. We've got nothing better to do." And they met this guy late at night, and they said, "We were out in the fields around near Silbury Hill, I think it was." And Graham turned around to me and he said, and it was extraordinary because there were things in the sky. And he said, "We saw 5 or 6 hovering lights moving around us." And he said, now, the only way they could have done that would whether they'd actually invested in having 5 drones with lights just to fool us. But as he said, why would they bother? And it was a chance encounter in the first place. And to set something up like that without having any feedback of seeing our reactions, you know,
And also, I mean, you know, even this idea of, because I was at a conference in Northampton recently, there was a thing called Trans States, which was about the kind of the intersection of like art and magic and the academy. So we had this nice kind of conference at the university there and so on. And one of the points that Nikki and I raised in our talk was how even something that's fake can lead to real world effects. So again, placebo is an example of that. My favorite example is the chess playing Turk, which was an automata from the 18th century. Again, yes. Wikipedia is our friend if you don't know the story. But basically, this was a machine that played chess. And in fact, it was a fake. There was literally a dude underneath the box, which appeared to have lots of gears and things. The dude was playing chess like underneath it and was a very good chess player, and so beat various people, including one of the guy who then came up with the automated loom, who, having been beaten by the chess playing Turk, thought, well, weaving isn't as complicated as chess playing. Maybe you can automate that. The answer to which is yes, you can. Hence, one of the things that fed into the Industrial Revolution, and that's definitely a real thing, the Industrial Revolution. Charles Babbage also played this machine and also lost, and then was starting to think, well, if you can do chess as an automata, what are the other limits that one might have about calculating and other processes? So this thing that wasn't real led to these real world effects, or certainly was instrumental in inspiring the possibility of those effects. Again, it's not a causal thing. The Turk didn't lead to the Industrial Revolution, but it was part of the, like Sarah Janes, you were saying about this kind of like slow kind of rippling out of changes within culture. It's like that. So let's imagine that these people had in fact managed to get some drones, and that they had found somebody who looked like they might be interested, and they brought you to that space and so on. Now, who knows? It may well be that your experience of that, or somebody else's the next week when they did it to another pair of unsuspecting individual tourists, that will have some kind of ripple out effect into the world. Time itself will tell, I suppose.
Because it's fascinating again how certain themes keep coming up in these series of programs. Because a few months ago we had Danielle Maria Heron on, and Danielle is somebody who is really into psychogeography and living and walking. She walks ridiculous distances. She walked the whole of the north of Scotland a few years ago, and she's now, I think she's just done the to Santiago de Compostela again. I think she's done it about 3 or 4 times. And interestingly enough, I met her at Breaking Convention a few years ago. And it is again interesting the way in which this relationship with the land. And this is why I wondered with hauntology. I've avoided hauntology for many years because I misunderstood what it was about. My background as a sociologist and a historian, it's very much what I'm interested in. But hauntology was such a negative, I didn't get what it was about. And it's highly intellectual, and it's highly to do with even the way music. I really, grew up in the late 60s and early 70s, and I love English folk music. And we know the way in which English folk and Fairport Convention, everybody else became part of that something magical that took place at that period of time,
Yeah, I mean, hauntology is for people who are now in their 50s to reconnect with their childhood experiences of growing up in the 70s and all of those utterly terrifying government information films about not playing with a fridge. And it's a kind of a remembering. It's not purely for that demographic, because there's other kind of versions of this kind of stuff that exist within other cultures. My children were into a kind of a version, an American version of something that's very, very similar. And I think it's that kind of, it's going into that childhood space of like everything is just a bit weird. Everything is a bit like in the sort of the naive sense of the term, surreal. Everything is just very strange. Look at these pylons. Look at these. What on earth are they for? Why are they buzzing? And what are they? Like not even without the understanding of that they're part of the electricity grid, but even allowing for that, it's like they still have this iconic strangeness about them. Yeah. So it's it's a re-enchantment of the world. It's a re-enchantment, particularly for people who perhaps grew up in the 1970s as I did. and it's a kind of a reconnection to that childhood thing. But it's also more broadly, it's about re-enchanting the world. It's about making this world, make the world, you know, it's like a make Britain spooky again. It's that kind of thing, you know, and it's delightful. You know, there's music. You know, the Ghost Box label is the go-to label, in my opinion, for some of that stuff. Belbury, Polly, and various things. And yeah, that kind of weird, folky kind of, you know, Jack Hargreaves meets some sort of weird undercover cult in a village.
It's all Nigel Neal, isn't it? You know, and it's still, you know, the idea of Quatermass and everything. And that's what I love about it. It is so evocative of that period. And isn't there, am I right in saying there's a series of books based around a mythical county or
there's
something in England?
Scarfolk, which I think you might be thinking about. Scarfolk. Yeah. Really good stuff. Really hilarious and brilliant. And also kind of, I think kind of linking in its, because it's hauntology, linking in this kind of slightly more than slightly frightening aspect of how it is to be a child, particularly a child. You know, I grew up under the shadow of nuclear war, and you know, do you know what, kids? Turns out that hasn't actually gone away, and so this fear of the, you know, the utter destruction of the world that one might live in. You know, here am I with my parents getting the Protect and Survive leaflet put through the doors. Like that was an actual thing. Hide under the stairs, whitewash your windows. There was an actual leaflet sent to every household in the British Isles. So that idea of like this, the scariness of the hauntology is partly a kind of bucolic longing for a childhood and a countryside that, you know, I was to some extent excluded from growing up in Stevenage, although having the wild edges of the place that I could range to. And of course, this is way before, you know, digital technologies and so on allow people to interact in these different ways. So there's a kind of strange loneliness about it. There's a strange sense of weird, isolated communities about it. There's a bucolic delight in it. And there is a nightmare fear of terror. It's very like the experience of being a child, unfortunately, in our culture. Maybe it's always been thus, but certainly that nightmare fear of terror, unfortunately, does seem to have not gone away.
Do you know, I think the ultimate, I mean, it was interesting the way you referenced earlier on about demonic consciousness and the work of Patrick Harper, which is really fascinating. But also, I think that the ultimate, for me, the ultimate TV program that defined for me the feeling of hauntology was that Jonathan Miller, Alice in Wonderland, that they did in about 1967, 68. And I regularly watch that on YouTube. And I still find it the most completely disturbing thing you can ever watch. And it's Alice in Wonderland, you know. And Sarah and I, we did that Alice in Wonderland event, didn't we?
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with TV being, or the way TV was presented in the 70s as being a sort of new, weird, and now it's being produced, and films are being produced in this increasingly formulaic, boring, kind of provoke excitement or make you feel weird, or you know, it doesn't kind of have the same sort of dreamy effect that things used to have. I mean, I do think there's definitely something about young consciousness that is, you have a more rich experience of the world around you, definitely. And I remember, I mean, I especially was terrified of the fridge at a tip information film or advert, I remember from being a kid. And, you know, and I think you're right that we all were subject to the same things, where I think there's almost like too much available to us now, and we're so hardwired into perceiving the world through the internet that we don't kind of, I remember as a kid at school, there were fads, there were like 2 monthly fads where everyone would get the same toy or the same thing or be into the same thing or watch the same TV.
We lost
cultural phenomenon like it used to feel then.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah, you've frozen as if the Archons have got you again. But we can carry on until we get you back.
Okay.
We got you back. Are you back? Are you back from that place that we can never speak of? Are you back from the Summerland? Are you back from the Summer Isles? Because that was the other great movie of that period, wasn't it? You know, The Wicker Man.
Of course.
The Wicker Man.
Of course. And I guess also, you know, like if I think about my own experience, those slightly grainy photographs of Alex and Maxine in the witchcraft books of the 1970s, you know, those things like
Oh, yes.
things like The Owl Service by Alan Garner, which the Times Literary Supplement described as a book that 14-year-olds love and 18-year-olds can't understand. And the television adaptation to that, which is really fantastic, you know, Children of the Stones, all of that sort of stuff. And I think it's interesting, Sarah, what you say about this, you know, is it different for kids today? I don't know. I know that certainly my one of my sons was really into what was like another kind of like hauntology thing. I forget its name off the top of my head, but he went to like an event associated with it. It was like an American sort of hauntology thing. You know, set in this kind of imagined, you know, Midwestern town kind of stuff, you know. So I think that the opportunities for children to explore and develop their own magic and to find that kind of, you know, the space to do that, I don't know if those are reduced. I suspect that potentially they may be, in as much as if you're playing a game, for example, even something unstructured like an Animal Crossing, for instance, there's still like the gameplay is already mapped out for you. But I think that there's also a real awareness of, you know, getting kids out into the woodland, getting them out into kind of landscape. You know, I know plenty of young people who are teaching other like kids and older people. In fact, actually recently my son was down in Cornwall working with a friend of mine as part of an art thing, doing art on the beach, you know. So I think there's also an awareness of the fact that unless we give people these opportunities, they won't simply take them because there's nothing else to do, because there are plenty of other things to do, you know. Like you need to support somebody to actually go out into the landscape and start playing around with a random stick in the dirt, because there is an infinite supply of content which can be engaged with. But once you get someone, you know, and I speak as someone who I've done lots and lots of teaching in schools, once you open up the possibility of the curiosity, it will flow, because that's what we are as human beings designed to do, certainly when we're young.
That again is so important. I'm so delighted to hear that you're actually going out into schools and talking to children. Are you talking about the kind of subjects we're talking about now with them?
No. I mean, I've for many years have worked in museums and galleries, and sometimes I've been basically the dude from the museum who turns up in your tiny little Devon school with a box full of interesting stuff. But it's the same in as much as my role as what in the trade is called an engagement consultant. Is my role is to work with collections or spaces in order to evoke people's curiosity. So the example I often give is with Exeter Museum, the Royal Albert Memorial Museum. A few years back, I came up with a series of games you can play in the gallery. So when you get a bunch of kids into a gallery, they can have a thoroughly tedious time looking at a bunch of old boring stuff in a case. You know, who cares about this? Like, when's it lunchtime? But you can also say to them, okay, we're going to go into the gallery now. You're going to go in as a ninja thief. Your overlord has commissioned you to steal something from this gallery. Stay low, avoid the security, see if you can just not be seen by as many members of the public as possible. I'd like you to go around this gallery, look at all the objects, decide on the one you're going to steal. Come back and tell me what it is and why. So it's about evoking curiosity by changing linguistically. So there's the power of magic being deployed through words, which changes the environment. So now I'm not just a kid in the museum, I'm a ninja come to steal something, right? So I inhabit this new personality. If I spend my time going, oh, I'm really a ninja, or am I just imagining that I'm a ninja? I will miss the boat. So I have to be a ninja. I go in, I look at all the stuff, I come back and I tell the guy who's just given us this exercise, you know, which thing I want to steal. At which point the person can go, interesting, you chose that one because blah, blah, blah. And I can now tell you some stuff about it if you like, and you'll care and you'll remember it. I guarantee it, because you've picked it from all the things. Huh? So this is a good, hopefully, way of manipulating people to evoke their curiosity. You know, the word education means to lead out from. It doesn't mean to push information in. Educare is to lead out. So we lead out, we evoke the curiosity of people and then they explore. And that's just what we do. You know, anything else is a tragic waste of an opportunity to go to a museum. You know?
So, I mean, I was just thinking when I was a kid how that would have been a fascinating thing to do, and a wonderful piece of imaginative thinking. You know, you're a ninja doing this, and it's a term you've used on various occasions during this discussion. You know, magical realism, and again, you know, I'm reminded. I've read it many times. The Marquez book, was it 100 Years of Solitude? And just the way in which the magic just comes into this very mundane story. And then the people turn up on a magic carpet and it just throws you completely. And of course, it's like the Rising of Borges as well. You know, it's just... Yeah. And we need the magical in our lives, don't we?
So it's easily found. It is literally right here, right now. So things I would recommend, Looking for Eric, which is a Ken Loach movie, which is a movie about football, which is not necessarily my natural territory. I recommend that. Very, very good magic realist film about self-transformation and the power of engaging with spirit entities. Looking for Eric. Yeah, very good.
Ken Loach. Wow.
Ken Loach. Yeah, absolutely. Very good film. And the thing about magic is that it is just around the corner. There's a writer, Lionel Snell, aka Ramsey Jukes, one of the best writers, in my opinion, on magic. Certainly, contemporary, dude is around now, and he talks about the experience of like trying to see the aura of a rowan tree. And he says, he struggled as a young man for a long time of staring at the rowan tree and kind of, doing various breath exercises and things. And then he sort of says, well, imagine you could see the aura of the rowan tree. Just imagine you could. What would it look like? Well, I don't know. It would be sort of perhaps pinkish color, and maybe it would be like russet here. Maybe it would be in the sort of broadly the form of the tree, but perhaps it would be, oh, I see. Okay. So imagine that a little bit further, and imagine it further, and imagine it further, and start to get to the point where you realize that, yes, it's true, we can be deluded, we can be fooled by things, and we have things like science, the attempt to use intersubjective reality testing in order to establish truth. That's a valuable way of doing it. We can also completely try and remove the imagination, so we simply respond, like the way that we are trained in martial arts practice. But most of our world is imaginal. And so by turning up the dial on that imagination, turning up the dial and saying, just for argument's sake, playfully, as if, well, the aura, I think it would be like this. It would be maybe this kind of shape. Okay, so when you walk towards this, can you feel the aura? Well, perhaps you can. Okay, interesting. Could you do it with your eyes closed? Would you still stop at the same point? Would you feel? Would you, if you had dowsing rods, would they cross perhaps where the aura? Oh, interesting. Now, again, causally, is it true or not true? Mate, I've got no idea how my hands work, let alone anything else. Beats me.
Yes.
But the phenomena is there, and the phenomena can be explored, and it can be utilized. It can be utilized to open up possibilities, create curiosity, make transformations that are, for argument, nominally speaking, with the topology of this, inside of us and indeed outside of us as well. And it's a continual process. It's not a process of, I do this thing, I get the answer, because all the answers are provisional and all the answers are inherently limited, which is why it's about the occult, the thing that escapes the possibility, that escapes the boundary, whether that's of language or of our understanding of causality. It's that's our interesting thing. And that's the thing that we yearn to know, explore, trying to know, and perhaps we'll never know. And that's the delight of it.
I think that is the perfect ending. That final thing you just said then was absolutely magically wonderful. Really, really good. And I can imagine that we're probably, Henri Corbin is probably bouncing up and down somewhere saying, it's the mundus imaginalis. These guys are really bringing it back and using the ideas of that. And talking about bringing back, Sarah, have you remanifested?
I think so, but my internet is a bit dicey today, actually. So can you hear me?
We can, which is good. Okay, well, I think that was simple. I thoroughly enjoyed every second of that, as I knew I would. A wonderful exchange of ideas. We could go on for hours and hours on this. But okay, so I'm sure that there's going to be an awful lot of people, Julian, who are very keen to link in with you and your fascinating work. So could you give us any details of your website, events you're doing, these kind of things now? And by the way, I'm delighted that you did actually mention Breaking Convention, because you told me earlier on this morning about it. And I thought, oh my God, I'm so excited about that. But I'm glad you actually mentioned it. So can you contact details and everything else, please?
Yeah, really, really simple. JulianVayne.com. That's it. You know, there's a contact form. There's some blah about the stuff that I do. There's links to a few podcasts and various other kind of things there. Instagram is quite a good thing. Like, I tend to post, rather than posting events and stuff that I'm up to on the website itself, Instagram is probably the easiest thing to do. But, you know, old school Facebook and Twitter are also a thing. But JulianVayne.com is the easiest thing, I think, to direct people towards. What am I doing next? I'm just about to go off next month to Guatemala to run the Sacred Space Holder program, which is a retreat for people working with psychedelic medicines. And beyond that, yeah, lots of kind of teaching, often with Treadwell's books. So I often do online stuff with them, lectures and workshops. And there's a big project about the Kabbalah, which is coming out of that soon as well. So I'll just kind of throw that in as a little thing that hopefully, if anyone is interested in inner world journeying, using the Kabbalah in a really accessible, engaging way, Treadwell's going to be releasing that material fairly soon. What else? I don't know. Just, you know, living the life, trying to keep the lights on, all that kind of stuff. You know, here we are.
Simply wonderful. It's really, really great. So, Julian, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom and your ideas. It has been thoroughly enjoyable. And I hope everybody that's been listening to this live and people catching it dead or alive are also going to be enjoying it. So thank you very much, everybody. And we'll be all seeing you soon. And thank you very much to our special guest, Julian, and also to Sarah in the background there as well. So thank you so much, everybody. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you both. Bye-bye.